The stagecoach rattled into Tonopah Junction, Nevada on a blistering August afternoon in 1878, and Rebecca Zimmerman pressed herself against the worn leather seat, keeping her arms hidden beneath the folds of her dust-covered shawl, despite the oppressive heat that made sweat trickle down her spine. She had learned long ago that revealing her arms invited stares, whispers, and questions she had no desire to answer. The scars that crisscrossed her forearms from wrist to elbow told a story she wanted desperately to forget, each silvery line a testament to a time when pain had seemed like the only release from unbearable grief. The other passengers had already disembarked, eager to escape the cramped confines and stretch their legs after the bone-jarring journey from Virginia City. Rebecca waited, watching through the dusty window as they dispersed into the small mining town that would be her new home. She had nowhere else to go, no family waiting with open arms, no familiar faces to greet her. Her aunt's letter had been brief and businesslike, offering her a position helping in the boarding house she ran on the edge of town. It was charity, really, but Rebecca had swallowed her pride and accepted. After losing her parents to cholera 2 years ago, and spending the intervening time in a San Francisco boarding house where the landlady had looked at her with a mixture of pity and distrust, she needed a fresh start. She finally gathered her carpet bag and stepped down from the coach, the heat hitting her like a physical blow. Tonopah Junction sprawled before her, a collection of wooden buildings that seemed to shimmer in the afternoon sun. The main street was wide and dusty, lined with a general store, a saloon, a blacksmith shop, and various other establishments that served the miners who worked the silver claims in the surrounding mountains. The boarding house her aunt ran was visible at the far end of town, a 2-story structure painted white, though the paint was peeling in places. Rebecca adjusted her shawl and began walking, acutely aware of the curious glances from the townspeople. A woman traveling alone always drew attention, especially in a place like this where men outnumbered women 10 to 1. She kept her eyes down, focusing on putting one foot in front of the other, willing herself to be invisible. She had almost reached the boarding house when she heard the whispers behind her. Did you see her arms when she reached for her bag, covered in scars all up and down? What kind of woman has marks like that? Nothing decent, I would wager. Probably running from something. Rebecca's cheeks burned, but she kept walking. She had heard it all before. The speculation, the judgment, the assumptions that anyone marked as she was must have done something to deserve it. No one ever considered that sometimes scars were not punishment but survival, that the wounds she had inflicted on herself during the darkest days after her parents' death had been the only way she knew to make the internal pain visible, to give it form and substance she could control. She had stopped 2 years ago, had fought her way back from that abyss with the help of a kind doctor who had understood, and a determination to honor her parents' memory by living. But the scars remained, and with them, the shame. Her Aunt Martha greeted her at the door with a brisk hug and a no-nonsense assessment. Martha Zimmerman was her father's older sister, a widow who had headed west after her husband died and built a life for herself through sheer grit and determination. She was in her 50s, with iron-gray hair pulled back in a severe bun and eyes that missed nothing. "You are thin," Martha said, holding Rebecca at arm's length. "We will fix that. Come inside and I will show you your room." The boarding house was clean and well-maintained, with 6 guest rooms upstairs and a large dining room and kitchen on the ground floor. Martha employed 2 other women to help with the cooking and cleaning, and she introduced Rebecca to them briefly before leading her up the narrow stairs to a small room at the back of the house. "You will help with the cooking and serving meals," Martha explained. The miners who board here expect 3 hot meals a day and clean sheets once a week. The work is hard, but I pay fair wages and expect honest effort in return. Can you manage that?" "Yes, madam," Rebecca said quietly. "Thank you for taking me in." Martha's expression softened slightly. "You are family, child. Your father was a good man, and I know he would have done the same for me if our situations were reversed. But I will tell you straight, I have heard about your troubles, that business with the scars on your arms." Rebecca flinched, but Martha continued, her voice matter of fact rather than condemning. "I do not care what happened in your past or why you did what you did. That is your business. But I will not have you bringing shame to this house with gossip and speculation. Keep those arms covered while you are working, and do not give the busybodies in this town anything more to talk about. Is that understood?" "Yes, madam," Rebecca whispered, relief washing through her. At least Martha was not turning her away. The first week passed in a blur of hard work and exhaustion. Rebecca rose before dawn to help prepare breakfast for the boarders, spent the day cleaning rooms and doing laundry, then helped with dinner before collapsing into bed each night. The work was physically demanding, but she welcomed it. It kept her mind occupied and her hands busy, leaving little time for the dark thoughts that sometimes still crept in during quiet moments. She wore long sleeves despite the heat, even when the other women rolled up their sleeves to work more comfortably. She caught them exchanging glances sometimes, and she knew the whispers had reached them. But they were kind enough not to ask questions, and Rebecca was grateful for their discretion. It was on her 8th day in Tonopah Junction that she first saw Elijah Larson. She had gone to the general store to purchase some supplies Martha needed for the kitchen, grateful for the excuse to escape the stifling heat of the boarding house. The store was dim and relatively cool, and Rebecca was examining a display of canned goods when the door opened behind her, and a massive presence filled the space. She turned and found herself staring up at a man who seemed to have been carved from the mountains themselves. He stood well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders so broad they nearly brushed the doorframe. His chest and arms strained against a worn flannel shirt with the sleeves rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle. His dark hair fell past his shoulders in thick waves, and a full beard covered the lower half of his face. But it was his eyes that caught her attention, a startling blue-gray that seemed to see straight through her. He nodded politely, touching the brim of his hat. "Madam." His voice was deep and rumbling, like distant thunder, and Rebecca felt something flutter in her chest. She managed a small nod in return before turning quickly back to her shopping, her heart beating faster for reasons she could not quite name. She heard him speaking with Mr. Henderson, the store owner, about supplies he needed for his cabin up in the mountains. His voice carried easily through the small space, and Rebecca found herself listening despite her best efforts not to. "How long will you be staying up there this time, Elijah?" Henderson asked. "Through the winter, most likely," the mountain man replied. "I have enough pelts to trade now, and I need to stock up on flour, coffee, and ammunition. The rest I can hunt or trap as I need it." "You are a strange one, choosing to live all alone up there when you could have company down here in town," Henderson said, though his tone was friendly rather than judgmental. "A man like you could have his pick of employment. The mines are always looking for strong workers." "I prefer the solitude," Elijah said simply. "The mountains suit me better than crowds." Rebecca risked a glance over her shoulder and found him gathering supplies with an efficiency that spoke of long practice. Despite his size and rugged appearance, he moved with a surprising grace, his large hands handling items with care. She quickly looked away when his gaze shifted in her direction, not wanting to be caught staring. She finished her shopping and approached the counter to pay, but Henderson was still helping Elijah tally up his considerable order. Rebecca stood quietly, waiting her turn, trying not to be too aware of the man standing just a few feet away. "You are new in town," Elijah said, and it took Rebecca a moment to realize he was speaking to her. She looked up, meeting those penetrating eyes. "Yes, sir, I arrived last week." "You are Martha Zimmerman's niece," he said. It was not a question. "Yes, sir. I am helping her at the boarding house." He nodded slowly, studying her with an intensity that made her want to squirm. "It is good she has family here. Martha is a fine woman, works too hard for someone her age." "I do my best to help lighten her load," Rebecca said, surprised at how defensive she sounded. Something that might have been amusement flickered in his eyes. "I meant no criticism, madam, just an observation." Henderson finished totaling Elijah's supplies, and the mountain man paid in cash, surprising Rebecca. She had assumed he would be trading pelts, but clearly he had money. He gathered his purchases with ease, hefting what must have been nearly 100 pounds of supplies as if they weighed nothing. "Good day to you both," he said, nodding to Henderson and then to Rebecca before heading out the door. Rebecca watched him go, oddly disappointed by his departure. She shook herself mentally, annoyed at her reaction. She had no business being interested in any man, especially one who lived alone in the mountains and probably came to town only a few times a year. But that night, as she lay in bed listening to the sounds of the desert night, she found herself thinking about those piercing blue-gray eyes and the way they had looked at her, as if she were someone worth seeing rather than someone to be pitied or avoided. The next Sunday, Martha insisted that Rebecca accompany her to church services, held in a room above the general store since Tonopah Junction was too small and too new to have its own church building yet. Rebecca had not attended services since her parents' death, finding it difficult to reconcile their loss with any notion of a benevolent God, but she could not refuse her aunt without seeming ungrateful. The room was crowded and hot, packed with miners in their best clean shirts and the handful of respectable women who lived in town. Rebecca kept her arms carefully covered in a long-sleeved dress despite the heat, and she tried to ignore the curious stares and whispers that followed her entrance. She was surprised to see Elijah Larson sitting in the back row, looking distinctly uncomfortable in his clean but obviously old Sunday clothes. His hair had been pulled back and tied, and his beard had been trimmed, but nothing could make him look civilized. He was simply too big, too wild, too much a part of the mountains to ever truly fit within four walls. Their eyes met across the room, and he gave her a slight nod of recognition. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm and quickly looked away, focusing on the traveling preacher who had arrived in town the day before. The sermon was about redemption and second chances, about God's love for even the most lost and broken souls. Rebecca tried to listen, tried to find comfort in the words, but all she could think about was the scars hidden beneath her sleeves and the certain knowledge that some things were beyond redemption. After the service, Martha stopped to talk with several of the other women, and Rebecca stood quietly to the side, hoping to avoid conversation. But Mrs. Porter, the banker's wife and the self-appointed moral authority of Tonopah Junction, had other ideas. "Miss Zimmerman," she said, her voice carrying clearly across the room, "how are you finding our little town? It must be quite different from San Francisco." "It is very nice, madam," Rebecca said politely, recognizing the predatory gleam in the older woman's eyes. "Martha tells us you will be helping at the boarding house indefinitely. Does that mean you have no plans to return to California?" "No, madam. I plan to make my home here if the town will have me." "How refreshing. A young woman willing to work honestly, Mrs. Porter said, but there was something sharp in her tone. though I must say it seems terribly warm for long sleeves. Are you not uncomfortable in this heat?" The room had gone quiet, everyone listening now. Rebecca felt her throat tighten, but before she could formulate a response, a deep voice cut through the tension. "Some people have sense enough to protect their skin from the sun, Mrs. Porter," Elijah Larson said, stepping forward from where he had been standing near the door. "Unlike some of us who have spent so much time in the elements that we look like old leather." Several people laughed, breaking the tension, and Mrs. Porter's face flushed with annoyance at being interrupted. Elijah touched his hat to Rebecca, and then to Martha before heading down the stairs, effectively ending the confrontation. Martha quickly made their excuses and guided Rebecca out, and they walked back to the boarding house in silence. It was only when they were inside that Martha spoke. "Elijah Larson is a good man," she said quietly. "He keeps to himself mostly, but he has helped me more than once over the years. Fixed my roof after a storm, brought fresh meat when supplies were running low in a hard winter. He does not talk much, but he sees things, notices when people need help." "Why does he live alone in the mountains?" Rebecca asked, curious despite herself. "His family died when he was young. Parents and 2 sisters, all taken by fever in the same winter. He was only 16, but already a man grown in size and strength. He tried to make a go of the family farm for a while, but the memories were too hard. So he sold everything and headed west, ended up in these mountains about 10 years ago. Built himself a cabin and has been living there ever since, trapping and hunting. He comes to town maybe 3 or 4 times a year for supplies, and that is about all anyone sees of him." Rebecca absorbed this information, feeling an unexpected kinship with the mountain man. He understood loss then, understood the need to escape memories that cut like knives. The summer gave way to fall, and Rebecca settled into the rhythm of life in Tonopah Junction. She grew accustomed to the hard work and the heat, to the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed her wherever she went. She kept her arms covered and her head down, determined to prove herself through honest work rather than explanation or defense. She saw Elijah twice more before the weather turned cold. Once at the general store, where he nodded to her politely but did not speak, and once on the street when she was carrying water from the well. He had taken the buckets from her hands without asking, carried them to the boarding house, set them on the porch, and walked away before she could even thank him. "He fancies you," one of the other boarders, a young miner named Sam, said with a grin. "Old Elijah does not usually pay attention to anyone in town, but he watches you whenever you are around." "That is ridiculous," Rebecca said, flustered. "He was just being helpful." "If you say so," Sam said, but his grin suggested he did not believe her. Rebecca tried to dismiss the idea, but she found herself thinking about it more than she should. The notion that someone like Elijah Larson, strong and self-sufficient and unbothered by the judgments of others, might be interested in her seemed impossible. And yet, she could not deny the way her heart lifted whenever she caught sight of him, or the way his eyes seemed to seek her out in a crowd. The first snow came in late October, dusting the mountains white and bringing a sharp chill to the desert air. Rebecca was grateful for her long sleeves now, no longer needing to make excuses for covering her arms. She helped Martha prepare the boarding house for winter, making sure the windows were sealed against drafts and the woodpile was well stocked. It was a gray November morning when disaster struck. Rebecca had gone out to the woodshed to fetch more fuel for the kitchen stove when she heard shouting from the direction of town. She dropped the wood and ran toward the commotion, her heart pounding with fear. A crowd had gathered outside the livery stable, and smoke was pouring from the building. Rebecca could hear horses screaming inside, and several men were trying to organize a bucket brigade from the well. But the fire was spreading fast, and the stable owner was shouting that there were still 3 horses trapped inside. Without thinking, Rebecca grabbed a blanket from someone's wagon, doused it with water from the nearest bucket, and ran toward the stable entrance. Someone shouted for her to stop, but she ignored them. The horses' screams were unbearable, and she could not just stand by and do nothing. The smoke was thick and choking, and the heat was intense even near the entrance. Rebecca wrapped the wet blanket around herself and pushed forward, trying to see through the smoke. She found the first horse, a terrified mare rearing and kicking in her stall. Rebecca fumbled with the latch, her eyes streaming from the smoke, and finally got it open. The mare bolted past her toward the daylight, nearly knocking her down. She found the second horse, a gelding, and freed him as well. But the third horse was at the back of the stable, and the smoke was so thick now that Rebecca could barely breathe. She stumbled forward, calling out, trying to find her way. The horse was there, a young stallion, trapped in the corner. Rebecca reached for his halter, but the frightened animal reared up, his hoof catching her arm and ripping through her sleeve. Pain exploded across her forearm, but Rebecca ignored it, grabbing the halter and pulling the stallion toward where she hoped the entrance was. She was beginning to think she had gotten turned around, that they would both die in here, when strong hands grabbed her shoulders and a deep voice cut through the roar of the flames. "This way. Follow my voice. Elijah." Rebecca held tight to the stallion and followed the sound of that deep rumble, stumbling over debris until suddenly they were outside, gulping in fresh air while people cheered and the bucket brigade worked to control the fire. Rebecca fell to her knees, coughing and gasping, her lungs burning. Elijah was beside her, one large hand steady on her back while she caught her breath. The stallion had bolted to safety, joining the other horses someone had corralled in a nearby paddock. "Are you hurt?" Elijah asked, and Rebecca shook her head, still coughing too hard to speak. Then she looked down at her arm and saw blood soaking through the torn sleeve. "You are bleeding," Elijah said, his voice sharp with concern. He reached for her arm, and Rebecca instinctively jerked back, trying to hide it. But he was too quick and too strong, gently but firmly taking hold of her wrist. The torn fabric fell away, revealing not just the fresh wound from the horse's hoof, but also the network of old scars that crisscrossed her forearm. Rebecca saw the exact moment Elijah registered what he was seeing, and she braced herself for the disgust, the questions, the judgment. But none of it came. Elijah's eyes met hers, and what she saw there was not revulsion but something that looked almost like understanding. He carefully rolled up the ruined sleeve further, examining the cut from the horse's hoof with a clinical efficiency that suggested he had dealt with injuries before. "This needs cleaning and bandaging," he said. "Come on." He stood, pulling her gently to her feet, and led her away from the crowd toward the boarding house. Rebecca was too shocked and exhausted to protest, too aware of the whispers starting up again behind them. "Did you see her arms? Scars all over, like someone took a knife to her. What kind of woman does that to herself?" Rebecca felt tears prick her eyes, but she blinked them back fiercely. She would not cry, not in front of all these people who were so quick to judge what they did not understand. Elijah heard the whispers too. She saw his jaw tighten, saw the muscles in his shoulders bunch with tension. But he said nothing, just kept walking with her, his hand gentle but unyielding on her elbow. Martha was waiting on the porch, her face pale with worry. "Rebecca, are you hurt?" "I saw you run into that building, you foolish girl." "She needs her arm tended," Elijah said, guiding Rebecca inside. "Do you have clean bandages and whiskey?" Martha hurried to gather supplies while Elijah sat Rebecca down at the kitchen table. He worked in silence, cleaning the cut with careful efficiency. His hands, so large and rough, were surprisingly gentle as they moved over her scarred skin. Rebecca watched his face, waiting for the questions, but he just focused on his task with complete concentration. When the wound was clean, he poured whiskey over it, and Rebecca hissed at the sting. "Sorry," he murmured, and she was struck by the genuine concern in his voice. He bandaged the injury with neat, practiced movements, then sat back and looked at her steadily. "You were very brave," he said. "And very foolish. You could have died in there." "The horses were screaming," Rebecca said quietly. "I could not just leave them." "No," Elijah said, something like a smile ghosting across his face. "I do not suppose you could." He stood to leave, and Rebecca found herself speaking before she could think better of it. "Thank you for pulling me out, and for not—" She stopped, not sure how to finish. "For not what?" Elijah asked, though she suspected he knew exactly what she meant. "For not asking questions. For not looking at me like I am broken or damaged or wrong." Elijah was quiet for a long moment, his blue-gray eyes searching her face. Then he reached out and gently touched her bandaged arm, his fingers barely grazing the fabric. "Everyone has scars," he said quietly. "Some are just more visible than others. There is no shame in surviving whatever it was that hurt you badly enough to make you want to hurt yourself." Rebecca felt tears spill over despite her best efforts, and she quickly wiped them away. "Most people do not see it that way." "Most people are fools," Elijah said bluntly. "They judge what they do not understand and fear what makes them uncomfortable. But scars just mean you survived. They mean you are stronger than whatever tried to break you." He touched his hat to her and then to Martha, who had been hovering in the doorway, and left without another word. Rebecca sat at the table for a long time after he was gone, her mind whirling. No one had ever spoken to her like that about her scars, with such straightforward acceptance. The doctor in San Francisco had been kind, but there had always been an element of clinical detachment to his compassion. Elijah had looked at her damaged skin and seen strength, not weakness. Survival, not shame. Something shifted in her chest, a cautious unfurling of hope that maybe, just maybe, she was not as irredeemably broken as she had believed. The next morning, Martha told her that Elijah had left town, heading back up to his cabin in the mountains for the winter. Rebecca tried to ignore the disappointment that washed through her at the news. It was foolish to feel anything. He had been kind in a moment of crisis, nothing more. But she could not stop thinking about the way his hands had been so gentle on her scarred skin, the way his eyes had held understanding rather than judgment. Winter settled over Tonopah Junction with a vengeance. Snow fell heavily in the mountains, and temperatures dropped until the water in the wash basins froze overnight. The boarding house stayed busy, with miners seeking the relative warmth and comfort of Martha's hospitality, and Rebecca worked harder than ever to earn her keep. The whispers about her scars had intensified after the stable fire, but Rebecca found that Elijah's words had given her a new perspective. Let them whisper. Let them judge. She had survived things they could not imagine, and she was still standing. That meant something. Christmas came and went, marked by a modest celebration at the boarding house. Martha cooked a special dinner, and the boarders exchanged small gifts. Rebecca received a new shawl from her aunt and gave her a carefully embroidered handkerchief in return. It was a quiet holiday, but peaceful in its own way. January brought more snow and bitter cold. The passes into the higher mountains became impassable, and Tonopah Junction felt isolated, cut off from the wider world. Rebecca sometimes stood at her window and looked toward the mountains, wondering about Elijah in his cabin. Was he warm enough? Did he have enough supplies? Was he lonely? She told herself it was silly to worry about a man who had chosen solitude, who was clearly capable of taking care of himself. But the worry persisted anyway, a low hum of concern that colored her days. It was in early February, during a brief break in the weather, that Elijah came to town again. Rebecca was in the general store, purchasing thread for mending when the door opened and he walked in, bringing a blast of cold air with him. He looked thinner than she remembered, his face sharper beneath the beard, but his eyes were the same penetrating blue-gray. He saw her immediately, and something in his expression shifted, warmed. "Miss Zimmerman," he said, touching his hat. "How is your arm?" "Healed completely, thank you," Rebecca said, surprised and pleased that he had asked. "How is your winter going?" "Cold," he said with what might have been humor, "but I have been through worse." They stood looking at each other for a moment, the air between them charged with something Rebecca could not quite name. Henderson cleared his throat loudly, breaking the spell, and Elijah turned to conduct his business. Rebecca finished her purchase and was preparing to leave when Elijah spoke again. "Will you be at the church service on Sunday?" It was such an unexpected question that Rebecca just stared at him for a moment. Yes, I suppose so. My aunt usually insists." "Good," Elijah said, and left it at that. Sunday came, and Rebecca found herself taking extra care with her appearance, brushing her dark hair until it shone and choosing her best dress. She told herself it was just pride, wanting to look respectable for church, but she knew she was lying. Elijah was there, sitting in his usual spot in the back row. His eyes found her the moment she entered, and he gave her a small nod. Rebecca felt her cheeks warm as she took her seat beside Martha. The service seemed to last forever, and Rebecca could barely focus on the preacher's words. She was too aware of Elijah's presence behind her, too conscious of the way her pulse quickened every time she thought about him. When the service finally ended, people began filing out, and Rebecca found Elijah waiting at the bottom of the stairs. "Miss Zimmerman," he said formally, then glanced at Martha. "Mrs. Zimmerman, I wonder if I might have a word with your niece, with your permission, of course." Martha's eyebrows rose, but she nodded. "Of course. Rebecca, I will see you back at the house." When Martha had gone, Elijah turned to Rebecca, suddenly looking uncertain in a way she had never seen before. It was oddly endearing, this big, confident man struggling for words. "I have been thinking," he said slowly, "about what you said, after the fire, about people judging you for your scars." Rebecca felt herself tense, but she forced herself to meet his eyes. "What about it?" "It made me angry," Elijah said bluntly. "The way people whisper about you like they have any right to judge your pain, the way they make you feel like you have to hide." "There is nothing to be done about it," Rebecca said quietly. "People will think what they think." "Maybe," Elijah agreed, "but I wanted you to know that I do not think that way. I think," he stopped, took a breath, clearly struggling with emotions he was not accustomed to expressing. "I think you are one of the bravest people I have ever met. Running into that fire to save those horses, surviving whatever made you hurt yourself, coming here to start over even knowing people would judge you. That takes courage." Rebecca felt her eyes sting with tears. "Why are you saying this?" "Because I do not think anyone has said it to you before," Elijah said simply. "And because it is true." They stood in the cold sunlight, looking at each other, and Rebecca felt something shift between them, a recognition that went deeper than words. "I would like to call on you," Elijah said, the words coming out in a rush as if he had been holding them back and they could no longer be contained. "Properly, I mean, with your aunt's permission, if you would be agreeable to that." Rebecca's heart was pounding so hard she was sure he must hear it. Yes, I would be agreeable to that." The smile that broke across Elijah's face transformed him, making him look younger, less weathered. "Good, that is good." He seemed at a loss for what to say next, then settled for, I will speak with your aunt then. Make sure she approves." "She will," Rebecca said, thinking of Martha's earlier comments about Elijah being a good man. "I am sure she will." Elijah did speak with Martha that very afternoon, and whatever he said must have satisfied her because she gave her permission with what looked suspiciously like satisfaction. "About time that man showed interest in something other than his mountains," she muttered, but she was smiling. Elijah began calling on Rebecca every Sunday after church, and what started as stiff, formal conversations gradually eased into something more natural. He told her about his life in the mountains, about the animals he saw and the changing seasons, about the peace he found in solitude. She told him about growing up in San Francisco, about her parents and how much she missed them, about the dark time after their death when the world had seemed too painful to bear. He never flinched from her honesty, never looked at her with pity or disgust. He just listened, his blue-gray eyes steady on her face, and when she fell silent, he would sometimes reach out and take her hand, his touch gentle despite the calluses and scars on his own skin. It was in early March, when the snow was beginning to melt and the first hints of spring were touching the desert, that Elijah asked if she would like to see his cabin. "It is a long ride," he warned, "several hours up into the mountains. But I thought if you were willing, I would like you to see where I live, to understand that part of my life." Rebecca agreed without hesitation, and the following Sunday they set out on horseback, with Martha's slightly anxious blessing. Elijah had borrowed a gentle mare for Rebecca, and he rode beside her on his own horse, a sturdy gelding that looked nearly as big as he was. The ride was beautiful, following a trail that wound up through pines and aspens, past rushing streams swollen with snowmelt. The air grew cooler as they climbed, but it was clean and fresh, scented with pine and earth. Elijah pointed out animal tracks, identified bird calls, showed her the subtle signs of the mountain's life that she would have missed on her own. His cabin sat in a small clearing, backed up against a rocky cliff face that would provide protection from winter storms. It was built from logs, solid and well-made, with a stone chimney and oiled hide windows. A stream ran nearby, and there was a small corral for his horse and a shed for storing wood and supplies. Inside, the cabin was neat and surprisingly comfortable. A large stone fireplace dominated one wall, and there was a sturdy table, a rocking chair, shelves for supplies, and a bed covered with thick furs. Everything was well crafted and practical, made to last. "You built all this yourself?" Rebecca asked, impressed. "Over several years," Elijah confirmed. "It keeps me busy during the winter when trapping is slow." He made coffee, and they sat at his table, talking as the afternoon light slanted through the windows. There was an ease between them now, a comfort that Rebecca had never expected to feel with another person. Elijah saw her, really saw her, not just the scars or the whispers or the mistakes, but the whole of who she was. And somehow, miraculously, he seemed to like what he saw. As the sun began to lower toward the horizon, Elijah said they should head back to avoid riding in the dark. But as Rebecca stood to leave, he caught her hand, pulling her gently back. "Wait," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "There is something I need to say first." Rebecca's heart was hammering, but she stayed still, looking up into his face. "I know we have not been courting long," Elijah said, "and I know I am not much of a catch. I live alone in the mountains, I am not educated or refined, and I do not have much to offer beyond this cabin and my own 2 hands." "Elijah," Rebecca started, but he shook his head. "Let me finish, please." He took a breath, his hands tightening on hers. "But I care for you, Rebecca. More than I thought I could care for anyone. You are brave and kind and honest, and when I am with you, I do not feel so alone anymore. The mountains are peaceful, but they are also lonely, and I have been lonely for a very long time." Rebecca felt tears slipping down her cheeks, but they were not tears of sorrow. "I want to build a life with you," Elijah continued, his blue-gray eyes intense on her face. "If you will have me. I know I am asking you to give up town life and come live in these mountains, and I know that is no small thing. But I promise I will take care of you, protect you, do everything in my power to make you happy. And I promise I will never judge you for your past or your scars. To me, they are beautiful because they are part of you, and everything about you is beautiful to me." Before Rebecca could respond, Elijah dropped to one knee, still holding her hands in his. "Rebecca Zimmerman, will you marry me?" Rebecca was crying openly now, but she was also smiling, her heart so full it felt like it might burst. "Yes," she said, her voice shaking with emotion. "Yes, Elijah, I will marry you." He stood and pulled her into his arms, holding her tight against his broad chest, and Rebecca felt safer and more cherished than she had in years. They stood like that for a long time, just holding each other while the afternoon light painted the cabin in shades of gold. When they finally pulled apart, Elijah cupped her face in his large hands, his thumbs gentle on her cheeks. "I love you," he said, the words simple and profound. "I love every part of you, scars and all." "I love you too," Rebecca whispered, and when he kissed her, soft and sweet and full of promise, she knew she had finally found what she had been searching for without even realizing it. Not just acceptance, but true love. Not just a place to hide, but a home. They rode back to Tonopah Junction as the sun set, painting the sky in brilliant oranges and pinks. Martha was waiting on the porch when they arrived, and one look at their faces told her everything she needed to know. "About time," she said again, but she was beaming as she hugged them both. "When is the wedding?" They decided on April, giving them time to prepare but not waiting so long that the spring thaws would make the mountain trails impassable again. Martha threw herself into the preparations with enthusiasm, and the other women in town, whatever their previous reservations about Rebecca, seemed genuinely happy for her. Even Mrs. Porter managed a tight smile and some stiff congratulations. Rebecca spent the weeks before the wedding working alongside Martha, but she also spent every free moment with Elijah. He came to town more often now, willing to endure the crowds and the noise to be near her. They took long walks together, talking about their future, making plans for the cabin and the life they would build together. It was during one of these walks, on a warm evening in late March, that something happened that would stay with Rebecca for the rest of her life. They had walked beyond the edge of town, following a path that led toward the foothills. The desert was blooming after the winter rains, covered in wildflowers that seemed to glow in the fading light. Rebecca had pushed up her sleeves, no longer caring who might see, and they were sitting on a flat rock watching the sunset when Elijah reached for her arm. "May I?" he asked quietly, and Rebecca nodded, not sure what he was asking permission for. Elijah took her arm gently, turning it so the scars were visible in the golden light. Then, with a tenderness that made Rebecca's breath catch, he bent his head and kissed each scar one by one, his lips soft against the damaged skin. "Beautiful," he murmured between kisses. "Every part of you is beautiful." Rebecca was crying again, but they were healing tears, washing away years of shame and self-hatred. No one had ever touched her scars with anything but clinical detachment or carefully hidden revulsion. But Elijah touched them with reverence, with love, treating them not as marks of weakness but as badges of survival. When he had kissed every scar on both arms, he looked up at her, his eyes bright with emotion. "Do you understand now?" he asked. "Do you understand how I see you?" "I am beginning to," Rebecca whispered, and she leaned forward to kiss him, pouring all her love and gratitude into it. The wedding took place on a beautiful April morning with the whole town in attendance. The traveling preacher had come through again, and he performed the ceremony in the room above the general store, now decorated with wildflowers that Martha and the other women had gathered. Rebecca wore a simple white dress that Martha had helped her make, and she carried a bouquet of desert lupines and Indian paintbrush. But the most remarkable thing was that she wore short sleeves, her scarred arms visible to everyone who cared to look. She saw the whispers start as she entered the room, saw the pointed looks and raised eyebrows. But then she saw Elijah, standing at the front with the preacher, looking at her like she was the most precious thing in the world and nothing else mattered. When they spoke their vows, Elijah's voice was strong and clear, promising to love and cherish her for the rest of their lives. Rebecca's voice shook slightly, but she meant every word with her whole heart. And when the preacher pronounced them husband and wife, Elijah took her scarred hands in his and kissed them both before kissing her lips, a public declaration that he loved all of her, unconditionally and completely. The reception was held at the boarding house, with food and music and dancing. Rebecca danced with her new husband, feeling light and free in a way she had never imagined possible. Martha cried happy tears and hugged them both fiercely. Even Mrs. Porter managed to say something almost kind about what a lovely ceremony it had been. As the party wound down and the sun began to set, Elijah and Rebecca prepared to leave for the cabin. They would spend a few days there alone before Elijah needed to come back down to help Martha with some repairs she needed done. Then they would settle into their new life together, splitting their time between the mountains and town as needed. Martha hugged Rebecca tight, whispering, "Be happy, child. You deserve it." "I will," Rebecca promised, and she meant it. The ride up to the cabin in the moonlight was magical, the world painted in silver and shadow. When they arrived, Elijah carried her over the threshold, both of them laughing at the traditional gesture. Inside, he had prepared everything, with fresh flowers on the table and the fireplace laid ready to light. That night, as they lay together in the bed covered with furs, Elijah held Rebecca close and traced the scars on her arms with gentle fingers. "Tell me the story," he said softly. "If you are ready, I want to know all of you, including the parts that hurt." So Rebecca told him, haltingly at first and then with growing confidence. She told him about her parents' death, about the crushing grief that had made her feel like she was drowning. She told him about the first time she had deliberately hurt herself, how the physical pain had seemed to release some of the unbearable emotional pressure. She told him about the shame and the secrecy, about the doctor who had helped her understand that she was not beyond help, about the long, hard road to recovery. Elijah listened without interrupting, his arms solid and warm around her. When she finished, he kissed her forehead and said, "Thank you for trusting me with that. I know it was not easy to share." "It is easier with you," Rebecca said honestly. "You make me feel safe." "You are safe," Elijah promised. "Always. I will spend the rest of my life making sure you know that." They made love that night, gentle and sweet, and Rebecca felt the last pieces of her broken heart knitting back together. In Elijah's arms, she was not damaged or shameful. She was whole, beloved enough. The days that followed were the happiest Rebecca had ever known. She and Elijah settled into life at the cabin, and Rebecca discovered that she loved the mountains as much as he did. She learned to identify animal tracks and bird calls, to fish in the stream and preserve meat for the winter. Elijah taught her to shoot, to ride better, to read the weather signs in the clouds and wind. They made regular trips down to Tonopah Junction to help Martha, and to sell the furs and goods Elijah trapped and crafted. The townspeople gradually accepted Rebekah's scars, or at least stopped whispering about them quite so openly. It helped that Elijah was not shy about showing his affection for his wife, taking her hand or putting an arm around her shoulders regardless of who was watching. One Sunday after church, they were walking back to collect their horses when they encountered Mrs. Porter and several other women. Rebekah braced herself for pointed comments, but Mrs. Porter surprised her. "Mrs. Larson," she said, her tone more respectful than Rebekah had ever heard from her. "I wanted to apologize. I was not kind to you when you first arrived, and that was wrong of me. It is clear that you are a good woman, and your husband is fortunate to have you." Rebekah was so shocked she almost could not respond, but she managed. "Thank you, Mrs. Porter. That is very gracious of you." As they walked away, Elijah squeezed her hand. "See, even the toughest critics come around eventually." "I think they are more afraid of you than convinced by me," Rebekah said with a smile. "Good," Elijah said, only half joking. "Let them be afraid if it means they treat you with respect." Summer came, hot and dry, and Rebekah worked alongside Elijah to maintain the cabin and tend to a small garden she had planted. They spent long evenings sitting outside, watching the stars come out and talking about everything and nothing. Rebekah had never been so content, so at peace with herself and her life. It was in early autumn that Rebekah realized she was pregnant. She had suspected for a few weeks, but she waited until she was certain before telling Elijah. She chose a quiet evening when they were sitting by the fire, the first chill of fall in the air. "Elijah," she said, taking his hand, "I have something to tell you." He looked at her, immediately alert to the serious tone in her voice. "What is it? Are you all right?" "I am fine," Rebekah assured him, smiling. "Better than fine, actually. I am pregnant. We are going to have a baby." The expression on Elijah's face was one Rebekah would treasure forever. Shock, joy, wonder, and a hint of fear all chased across his features before settling into pure happiness. He pulled her into his arms, holding her tight. "A baby," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We are going to be parents. Are you happy?" Rebekah asked, though she could feel the answer in the way he held her. "Happy does not even begin to cover it," Elijah said, pulling back to look at her face. "Are you happy? Are you scared?" "Both," Rebekah admitted, "but mostly happy. I never thought I would have this, a family of my own. A husband who loves me, a child on the way. It feels like a miracle." "You are the miracle," Elijah said, kissing her softly. "You survived so much, fought your way back from such darkness, and now look at you. You are going to be an amazing mother." The pregnancy progressed smoothly, though Rebekah experienced the usual discomforts. Martha insisted they spend the last few months before the baby's arrival in town, where there would be help if anything went wrong. Elijah agreed, though Rebekah knew he missed the mountains. They took a room at the boarding house, and Elijah found work helping with various tasks around town to pass the time and earn some extra money. Rebekah's belly grew round and full, and she felt the baby moving inside her, a constant reminder of the new life they had created. The women of Tonopah Junction rallied around her, offering advice and hand-me-down baby clothes and knitted blankets. Even Mrs. Porter contributed, presenting Rebekah with an exquisitely embroidered christening gown. In late March of 1880, on a night when the moon was full and bright, Rebekah went into labor. Martha and 2 other women attended her, while Elijah paced anxiously outside the room, unable to sit still. The labor was long and difficult, lasting through the night and into the next day. There were moments when Rebekah thought she could not bear the pain, when she wanted to give up. But then she would hear Elijah's voice through the door, talking to Martha, his worry evident, and she would find the strength to keep going. Finally, as the sun was setting on the second day, the baby was born. A boy, healthy and strong, lunged, with a thick head of dark hair and his father's blue-gray eyes. When they placed the baby in Rebekah's arms, she wept with joy and exhaustion and overwhelming love. And when Elijah was finally allowed in, when he saw his son for the first time, the expression on his face was one of such pure, unguarded emotion that it made Rebekah's heart ache in the best possible way. "He is perfect," Elijah whispered, touching one large finger to the baby's tiny hand. The infant's fingers curled around it instinctively, and Elijah's eyes filled with tears. "He is absolutely perfect." They named him Thomas after Elijah's father, and he was baptized a month later in the same room where his parents had been married. Elijah held his son with surprising confidence for such a big man with such a tiny baby, and Rebekah watched them with a heart so full of love she thought it might overflow. Life with a baby was chaotic and exhausting and wonderful. Rebekah discovered reserves of patience she had not known she possessed, and Elijah proved to be a devoted father despite his initial nervousness. Thomas was a happy baby, quick to smile and curious about everything. When summer came and Thomas was old enough to travel, they returned to the cabin in the mountains. Rebekah had worried that she would find it isolating with a baby to care for, but instead, she found it peaceful. Thomas thrived in the clean mountain air, and watching Elijah with their son, teaching him about the world in soft murmurs even though Thomas was too young to understand, made Rebekah fall in love with her husband all over again. The years passed in a blur of happiness and hard work. Thomas grew into a sturdy, adventurous boy with his father's love of the mountains and his mother's quick mind. When he was 3, Rebekah became pregnant again, and this time she gave birth to a daughter they named Sarah, with her mother's dark hair and her father's strong will. 2 years after that came another son, James, who was quieter than his siblings but thoughtful and kind. And finally, when Rebekah was 32 and thought her childbearing days were behind her, came a surprise 4th child, another girl they named Martha after Rebekah's aunt, who had passed away peacefully in her sleep the previous winter. The cabin had been expanded over the years to accommodate their growing family, with an additional room built on for the children. Elijah proved to be as skilled a carpenter as he was a hunter and trapper, and the cabin was solid and comfortable, a true home. Rebekah taught the children their letters and numbers, reading to them from the small collection of books they had accumulated. Elijah taught them to hunt and track, to respect the mountains and the creatures that lived there, to be strong and self-sufficient. But more importantly, both parents taught their children about compassion, about not judging others for their differences or their struggles. Rebekah's scars were simply a part of her, as familiar to her children as the freckles on Thomas's nose or the gap in Sarah's front teeth. They grew up knowing that their mother had survived great pain and had come through it stronger, and that was nothing to be ashamed of. On quiet evenings, when the children were asleep and Elijah and Rebekah sat together by the fire, they would sometimes talk about how far they had both come. Elijah from his lonely existence in the mountains, Rebekah from the darkness that had nearly consumed her. "You ever regret it?" Rebekah asked one such evening when they had been married for nearly 15 years. "Giving up your solitude for this chaos?" Elijah looked around at the cabin at the evidence of their children everywhere, toys and books and small clothes hanging to dry. Then he looked at Rebekah, his blue-gray eyes warm with love. "Not for a single moment," he said firmly. "I thought I wanted to be alone, but I was just afraid. Afraid of losing people I loved the way I lost my family. But you taught me that love is worth the risk, that a life shared is infinitely better than a life lived in isolation." He took her hand, running his thumb over the scars on her wrist, a gesture that had become as natural as breathing over the years. "And you, Do you ever regret leaving town life for the mountains? Never, Rebecca said honestly. This is where I was always meant to be. With you, with our children, in this place where I can finally just be myself without fear of judgment. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, watching the fire burn low. Then Elijah spoke again, his voice soft. You know what I think about sometimes? That day in town when I first saw your scars. How close I came to just walking away, to not saying anything, because I did not want to intrude or make you uncomfortable. What made you stay? Rebecca asked. She had never asked before, had simply been grateful that he had. Your eyes, Elijah said simply. When you looked at me, I saw pain and fear, but I also saw strength. And I recognized something of myself in you. That need to escape, to find somewhere you could breathe. I could not walk away from that from you. Rebecca felt the familiar prick of tears, but they were happy tears. I am so glad you stayed. So glad you saw me, really saw me, scars and all. They are part of your story, Elijah said, kissing each of her wrists gently. And I love every chapter of you, even the painful ones. Because they made you who you are, and who you are is extraordinary. The years continued to pass, marked by seasons and celebrations, challenges and triumphs. Thomas grew tall and strong like his father, eventually building his own cabin a few miles from theirs, and bringing home a wife, a quiet girl from Tonopah Junction named Emma. Sarah proved to have a gift for healing, learning everything she could from the town doctor during their visits, and becoming known for her skill with herbs and remedies. James followed in his father's footsteps as a trapper and hunter, content with the solitary life of the mountains. And little Martha, true to the name she bore, grew into a fierce, determined young woman who eventually opened her own boarding house in town, carrying on her great-aunt's legacy. Rebecca and Elijah grew older together, their hair turning gray, their bodies showing the marks of years of hard work and good living. But their love never dimmed, never became routine or stale. They still held hands when they walked, still kissed each other goodnight every evening, still found reasons to laugh together. It was on their 30th wedding anniversary, surrounded by their children and grandchildren, that Elijah made a speech that had everyone in tears. 30 years ago, he said, his voice still strong despite his age, I married the bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. People whispered about her scars, judged her for her pain, but I saw the truth. I saw a survivor, a fighter, someone who had been through hell and come out the other side still capable of love and kindness. He turned to Rebecca, taking her hands in his. Every day with you has been a gift. Every moment of our life together has been exactly what I needed, even when I did not know I needed it. You gave me a family, a purpose, a reason to come down from these mountains and engage with the world. You made me better than I was, and I will spend whatever time we have left thanking God for bringing you into my life. Rebecca was crying openly, as were most of the people gathered in their home. I love you, she said simply, because what else was there to say? Then, now, and always. They kissed, and their children cheered, and the celebration continued into the night with music and laughter and stories told and retold until everyone knew them by heart. Rebecca and Elijah lived to see their grandchildren grown and starting families of their own. They lived to celebrate 50 years of marriage, a remarkable milestone that few reached. And when they finally passed, within months of each other, they did so peacefully, secure in the knowledge that they had built a legacy of love and acceptance that would continue for generations. The people of Tonopah Junction, which had grown considerably over the decades, remembered Rebecca Larson as a woman of quiet strength and endless compassion. They remembered how she had overcome whispers and judgment to build a good life, how she had raised children who were kind and capable, how she had never hidden her scars but wore them with quiet dignity. But most of all, they remembered the love story of Rebecca and Elijah, the woman with scarred arms and the mountain man who had kissed each scar and called them beautiful. It became a legend in the town, a reminder that true love sees beyond the surface, that strength comes in many forms, and that everyone deserves to be loved for exactly who they are. And if you were to visit the old cemetery outside Tonopah Junction today, you would find their graves side by side, the headstones weathered but still legible. Elijah Larson, beloved husband and father. Rebecca Larson, beloved wife and mother. And beneath Rebecca's name, an inscription that Elijah had requested before his death, words that captured the essence of their love, beautiful in every way, scars and all. It was a love story that proved that the deepest wounds can heal, that shame can transform into strength, and that sometimes the people who understand us best are the ones who carry their own scars, visible or not. It was a reminder that in the wild, untamed landscape of the American West, where survival required grit and determination, there was still room for tenderness, for acceptance, for the kind of love that sees a person truly and loves them completely. Rebecca had come to Tonopah Junction broken and afraid, hiding her arms beneath long sleeves even in the scorching heat, certain that she was too damaged for love or happiness. But she had found both in the most unexpected place, in the gentle hands and understanding eyes of a mountain man who saw her scars not as marks of shame but as evidence of survival. And in the end, that made all the difference. Not just for Rebecca, but for everyone whose life she touched, everyone who learned from her example that being broken does not mean being beyond repair, that scars tell stories of battles fought and won, that love can heal even the deepest wounds. The mountains still stand tall outside Tonopah Junction, and if you listen carefully when the wind blows through the pines, you might hear echoes of their story. The whispers of a town that learned to see beyond the surface, the laughter of children playing in the high country, the quiet murmur of two people who found in each other exactly what they needed. A love story for the ages, written in scars and survival, in acceptance and understanding, in the wild, beautiful landscape of Nevada in the late 1800s. A story that proved that sometimes the most beautiful things are the ones that have been broken and mended, that the strongest people are the ones who have survived their worst days and kept going, and that love, real love, does not shy away from scars but embraces them as part of the whole. Rebecca and Elijah Larson lived their truth, loved fiercely, and left behind a legacy that transcended their own lives. In doing so, they created something eternal, something that would inspire others for generations to come. They proved that in a harsh, unforgiving landscape, gentleness could flourish, that in a time and place where conformity was expected, authenticity could thrive, that no matter how dark the night, dawn always comes. And that is the greatest love story of all, the kind that changes not just the lovers themselves but everyone around them, rippling outward like stones thrown into still water, creating circles of change and growth and understanding that extend far beyond what the original lovers could have imagined. Rebecca had once been a woman who hurt herself to make internal pain visible, to create something she could control when everything else felt chaotic and overwhelming. But she became a woman who understood that scars, whether self-inflicted or given by life's cruelties, do not define us. What defines us is what we do after we have been wounded, whether we let the scars keep us trapped in the past, or use them as proof that we survived, that we are stronger than we knew. And Elijah, who had chosen isolation to protect himself from loss, learned that opening his heart was not a weakness but the greatest strength. That loving Rebecca, scars and all, made him more fully human, more complete, than all his years alone in the mountains ever could. Together, they built something extraordinary from the broken pieces of their separate pasts. They created a home, a family, a love story that would be told and retold until it became legend. And in that telling, they gave hope to others who carried their own scars, visible or hidden, that they too deserved love, acceptance, and happiness. The Wild West was a place of harshness and beauty, of survival and struggle, but it was also a place where new beginnings were possible, where people could reinvent themselves, where love could flourish in the most unexpected places. Rebecca and Elijah's story was proof of that, a testament to the resilience of the human heart and the transformative power of unconditional love. And so their story ends not with tragedy or loss, but with fulfillment and peace. With grandchildren who carried their legacy forward, with a town that learned from their example, with two people who found each other against all odds and built a life together that was everything they had never dared to dream possible. She had scars all over her arms, and they whispered about her. But the mountain man kissed each one and called them beautiful, and in doing so, he gave her the greatest gift anyone can give another person: the freedom to be fully, authentically herself, scars and all. And that, in the end, was all either of them had ever really needed.